The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a cold, eerie twilight. As Jack wandered through the outskirts of town, his eyes caught a glimpse of something unnatural. Hidden behind a thick curtain of vines and overgrown trees was a set of rusted iron gates, slightly ajar, beckoning him forward. An unsettling breeze whispered through the air, carrying a faint, metallic scent that clung to his nostrils. Jack paused, hesitant, but curiosity tugged at him like an invisible hand. Beyond the gates lay the remnants of what had once been a lively carnival, the Dark Circus, abandoned decades ago after a series of mysterious disappearances. The rumors had faded with time, but something about this place felt wrong, as if the very earth beneath it rejected the idea of life. As Jack crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted. A shiver ran down his spine as his footsteps crunched over dead leaves and broken glass. The silence was deafening, so thick it pressed against his ears, making him feel as though the world itself had stopped breathing. The once colorful tents were now nothing more than tattered shrouds of fabric, flapping softly in the wind. There were no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals scurrying through the brush. It was as if everything within these grounds had been drained of life. A sudden wave of nausea hit Jack, as if the very air around him was tainted, too thick to breathe without consequence. Ahead of him, looming like a nightmare from the past, stood the main tent. Its faded, striped fabric sagged under the weight of years of neglect. At its entrance, a weathered sign hung crookedly, the words barely legible, "Welcome to the greatest show on earth." The words, once welcoming, now felt like a mockery. Jack could almost hear distant, ghostly echoes of laughter, but there was no one. His heart raced as his instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't. Something more powerful than fear pulled him deeper into the forgotten circus, a force that gnawed at his mind and whispered in the back of his thoughts. As he approached the tent, Jack noticed something disturbing: a carousel, still intact despite the decay around it. Its painted horses were chipped and weathered, their eyes hollow and black, yet it stood as though waiting for a rider. The silence was broken by a single creak, the sound of the carousel slowly turning, though there was no wind to move it. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed as he took a cautious step forward. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a flash of movement. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing, only the oppressive emptiness of the park staring back at him. But then he saw it, a figure, standing in the distance. Its outline was unmistakable, a tall figure dressed in a faded clown costume, its once vibrant colors now dulled and stained. The clown's face was obscured in shadow, but Jack could feel its eyes on him, watching with a malevolent intensity. His skin prickled with cold sweat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, yet its presence was suffocating. Jack's mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was seeing, but every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong. He fumbled for his phone, desperate to take a picture, proof that he wasn't losing his mind. But when he lifted the device, the figure was gone. Jack's hands trembled as he lowered the phone, dread settling deep into his bones. The figure wasn't in front of him anymore, but he could feel it closer, hidden just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. He turned slowly, every movement measured, but no matter which way he looked, the carnival felt alive, shifting, breathing. Something was here with him, something ancient and evil, waiting for him to step further into its trap. Every step forward was a step deeper into the unknown, and Jack knew, with a chilling certainty, that once he entered the tent, there would be no turning back. As Jack stood frozen before the entrance of the decaying tent, memories began to stir within him, like shadows creeping out of the corners of a forgotten room. He hadn't thought about this place in years, not since he was a child. But now, the air felt thick with a sense of déjà vu, as if the very ground beneath his feet was calling out to something buried deep in his mind. His pulse quickened as flashes of a distant memory clawed their way to the surface, a day from long ago, when his parents had brought him here, to the Dark Circus. He could vaguely remember the joy of that day, the laughter and the colors. But now those memories felt tainted, corrupted by a darkness he had never noticed before. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain in his wrist. Jack looked down confused and saw a thin scar running along his skin, one he couldn't remember ever having. It pulsed under his touch, as if alive, and with it came a flood of repressed images, flashes of the past he had forced himself to forget. He remembered holding his father's hand as they entered the park, his mother laughing beside them. But then something shifted. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a haunting melody that echoed through the air, a twisted version of a lullaby his mother used to sing to him at night. The melody began to hum softly in the back of his mind, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't coming from his memories. It was real, echoing through the air, seeping from the very walls of the tent in front of him. Jack's heart raced as the melody twisted and warped, becoming something sinister. The song was pulling him back, forcing him to relive something he had buried deep within himself. His hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an old photograph he had carried with him for years without understanding why. The photo was faded, the edges worn and frayed from time. It was a picture of Jack as a child, standing in front of the carousel, his parents beside him, smiling. But in the corner of the image, barely visible at first, was the figure of a clown, its grotesque face leering at them from the shadows. Jack's blood ran cold. He had never noticed the clown before. In all the years he had looked at this photograph, the figure had never been there. But now, it was staring back at him, a sinister grin stretched across its face, as if mocking him. His breath hitched in his throat as he realized something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a forgotten memory. This was something darker, something that had been waiting for him to return. A sudden gust of wind tore the photograph from his hand, sending it fluttering into the tent's entrance. Jack hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to run, but his feet moved forward, as if drawn by an unseen force. The closer he got, the louder the lullaby became, its eerie notes wrapping around him like a vice. As he stepped into the tent, the atmosphere changed. The air was colder, heavier, and every sound seemed to be swallowed by an oppressive silence. The tent was vast, far larger on the inside than it had appeared from the outside, and at the center of the ring stood a single spotlight, flickering weakly. But Jack's attention was drawn to something else. In the shadows beyond the spotlight, barely illuminated, was a small wooden box, an old, weathered toy chest. His breath caught in his throat as memories flooded back. That chest, it had been his, a gift from his parents when he was a child. He hadn't seen it in years, and yet, here it was, in this cursed place. Slowly, he approached it, his fingers trembling as he reached for the lid. The moment he touched the wood, a cold shiver ran through his entire body. The box felt wrong, unnatural, as if it had absorbed the darkness around it. As Jack lifted the lid, a thick, acrid smell hit him, a mix of rot and decay. Inside the chest, nestled among old, tattered toys, was a small, porcelain clown doll, the same doll he had once loved as a child. But now, its face was cracked, its eyes empty and hollow, staring back at him with a lifeless gaze. Jack stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He remembered this doll, remembered playing with it, but there was something else, something darker. A memory he had suppressed for years came rushing back with brutal clarity. The last time he had played with the doll, he had heard whispers, voices that didn't belong to his parents, voices that came from the shadows of his bedroom. The whispers had promised him things, dark things, and that night his father had disappeared. No one had ever found out what happened to him, but deep down, Jack had always known. And now, standing in the heart of the Dark Circus, he realized the truth. The clown, the park, the whispers, they had taken his father, and they had been waiting for him ever since. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen before the toy chest, the porcelain clown doll grinning up at him with its cracked, lifeless face. His breath came in shallow gasps as a cold sweat broke out across his skin. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, like an invisible hand tightening its grip around his throat. The distant, haunting lullaby still echoed faintly in the background, but now it was accompanied by something else, a whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. It called his name over and over, drawing him deeper into the suffocating shadows of the tent. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, but he was rooted to the spot, as if the very ground beneath him had come alive and was holding him captive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they surrounded him completely. Jack clutched his head, trying to block them out, but they seeped into his mind like poison. Then, in a sudden, horrific clarity, the whispers coalesced into a voice, the voice of the clown. It wasn't speaking to him directly, but instead offering him a choice, one that twisted his stomach with dread. In the center of the tent, a figure began to materialize, slowly taking shape within the dim spotlight. It was his father. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw the familiar face, pale and gaunt, eyes wide with terror, but unmistakably his father. The clown's voice echoed in his mind, mocking and cold. It offered him an impossible choice. He could save his father from the nightmare he had been trapped in for decades, but only at the cost of something irreplaceable. Jack would have to sacrifice his most precious memory, the last happy moment he had with his family, the one memory that had kept him going all these years. That moment, that feeling of warmth and safety, would be erased from his mind forever, leaving behind only a hollow emptiness where joy once lived. Or Jack could walk away, leaving his father to suffer in the shadows for eternity, but keep that precious memory intact, untouched by the darkness that threatened to consume him. The weight of the decision crushed him, and his mind spun with the horror of it. He had searched for his father for years, clinging to the hope that one day he would find him. But now that he was faced with the possibility of saving him, the price was too steep to bear. Could he truly give up the last piece of happiness he had? The memory of that day at the carnival, of his mother's laughter, of his father lifting him onto his shoulders as they watched the carousel spin, that was all he had left. Without it, who would he be? What would become of him if the last light in his life was snuffed out? Yet, as Jack stared into his father's eyes, he saw the desperation, the silent plea for release. His father's body trembled as if weighed down by invisible chains, his face etched with decades of suffering. The thought of leaving him behind, trapped in this hellish place for eternity, was unbearable. But what would saving him mean for Jack? The thought of erasing that cherished memory made his heart ache in a way he had never felt before. It was more than just a memory. It was his anchor, his only connection to a time when life had been good, when the darkness had not yet crept into his world. As the whispers continued to swirl around him, urging him to decide, Jack felt his grip on reality slipping. The walls of the tent seemed to close in, the air thickening with an unseen presence that pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His father's figure flickered in and out of focus, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around them. The clown's voice grew louder, taunting him, laughing at his indecision. Jack knew he didn't have much time. The longer he waited, the more the darkness would consume him, trapping him here just like his father. A new wave of fear washed over him as he realized the truth. If he didn't make a choice, he too would be lost to the shadows, a prisoner of the Dark Circus, just like his father. The clown had been waiting for him, luring him back to this cursed place to finish what had been started so many years ago. Jack's hand shook, his mind racing as the full weight of impossible choice pressed down on him. He could feel the darkness creeping closer, reaching for him, pulling at the edges of his sanity. And then, as if from deep within the recesses of his mind, a memory surfaced, not the cherished one of his family at the carnival, but a darker, forgotten moment. The night his father had disappeared, Jack had heard the whispers even then. They had offered him a choice, and in his fear, he had run, abandoning his father to the shadows. It was his fault. He had made the wrong choice before, and now, fate had brought him back here to face the consequences. Jack's chest tightened as the realization hit him. This was his chance for redemption, his chance to make things right. With trembling hands, Jack reached for the photo in his pocket, the image of his family at the carnival. Tears blurred his vision as he stared at the smiling faces, knowing this would be the last time he would ever see them. The weight of the memory was heavy in his heart, but he knew what he had to do. Slowly, painfully, he made his decision. With a final, shaky breath, he whispered, "I choose my father." As the words left his lips, the memory began to fade, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The warmth, the joy, the laughter, all of it dissolved into nothingness. Jack felt a cold emptiness settle in its place, a hollow ache that threatened to consume him. But in that moment, the figure of his father began to move, his chains breaking as the darkness released its grip. Jack had made his choice, but at what cost? The clown's laughter echoed through the tent, and Jack knew that, though he had saved his father, he had lost a part of himself that he could never get back. The tent's oppressive silence was shattered by a series of faint, chilling whispers that seemed to swirl around Jack like a cold wind. They were too low to be deciphered, yet they crawled under his skin, making his flesh prickle with unease. The very air inside the tent felt different now, heavier, as though it were thick with an unseen presence that pressed down on him, suffocating. Every breath he took felt labored, and the shadows that clung to the corners of the tent seemed to deepen, twisting into shapes that danced just beyond the reach of the flickering light. Jack's heart thudded in his chest as he scanned the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the whispers, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The shadows themselves seemed alive, writhing and shifting in ways that defied logic. Jack's eyes darted from corner to corner, each movement only confirming that the darkness had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just the absence of light anymore. It was something sentient, something watching him with malicious intent. Every so often, he caught glimpses of figures in the dark, fleeting shapes that disappeared the moment he tried to focus on them. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and he instinctively took a step back, but his feet felt like they were sinking into the ground, as if the tent itself were trying to swallow him whole. The whispers grew louder now, more distinct, though still just out of reach of comprehension. Jack strained to listen, trying to piece together their meaning, but all he could hear were fragments of words, disjointed and maddeningly vague. He could have sworn they were calling his name, softly at first, but growing more insistent with every passing second. The voices were no longer just in the air. They were in his head, burrowing deep into his thoughts like worms. His skin crawled as the sensation of invisible fingers brushed against his neck, his arms, his back. But when he spun around, there was no one there. Only the darkness. The ground beneath him shifted, groaning as though something massive and ancient was stirring beneath the surface. The faint creaks and moans of the tent fabric above him felt almost organic, like the sound of breath being drawn in and out, as if the entire structure had come alive. The walls seemed to ripple, undulating like the skin of a great beast, and Jack could no longer tell if he was standing on solid ground or on the belly of some colossal, slumbering creature. His sense of reality began to slip, the lines between what was real and what was imagined blurring until they were indistinguishable. Every shadow seemed to be watching him, mocking him, daring him to move deeper into their grasp. Suddenly, Jack's eyes were drawn to the center of the tent, where the small wooden box sat, its lid now slightly ajar. A cold draft escaped from within, carrying with it a rancid odor of decay and something far worse, a deep, unnatural cold that chilled him to the bone. The whispers intensified, their cadence more rhythmic now, almost like a chant, as though urging him to approach. His legs moved against his will, each step slow and deliberate, as if he were being pulled forward by an invisible force. The closer he got to the box, the more distorted the world around him became. The air shimmered, warping his vision, making the ground beneath him feel like it was shifting in waves. When he reached the box, Jack hesitated. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices layering over one another, their meanings just beyond his reach. His hands trembled as he reached for the lid, a sickening sense of dread tightening his chest. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid fully, and what he saw inside made his blood run cold. Inside the box lay the porcelain clown doll, but now its eyes were open, gleaming with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce straight into Jack's soul. The doll's face was no longer cracked and lifeless. It was animated, its mouth twitching in the beginnings of a sinister grin. As Jack recoiled in horror, the shadows around him erupted into movement. Figures materialized out of the darkness, grotesque and twisted, their forms barely human. Their eyes were hollow, their skin stretched tight over bone, and they moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. They encircled Jack, their heads tilted at odd angles as they stared at him with expressions of malice and hunger. The air grew thick with the smell of rot and decay, and the whispers now became voices, angry, pleading, mocking. They clawed at Jack's mind, filling his thoughts with visions of torment and despair. One of the figures stepped forward, its limbs creaking as it moved. It reached out a hand, long fingers tipped with sharp, jagged nails, and touched Jack's arm. His skin burned at the contact, a searing pain that shot up his arm and spread through his entire body. The figure's touch seemed to drain the life from him, pulling at his very essence. Jack stumbled back, gasping for breath, but the figures only drew closer, closing in on him. The tent itself seemed to be shrinking, the walls pressing inward as if trying to crush him. In the midst of the chaos, the clown doll's voice echoed through the tent, clear and mocking. "You came back," it whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You couldn't resist, could you?" Jack's vision blurred as the world around him spun. The shadows, the voices, the grotesque figures, they all converged on him, and he realized with mounting terror that this was exactly what they had wanted all along. They had been waiting for him, luring him back to the place where it had all begun. The walls of the tent seemed to close in, and Jack's surroundings faded into darkness. He was no longer sure if he was in the real world or a nightmare, but one thing was certain: the shadows were alive, and they had no intention of letting him go. The whispering continued, soft and relentless, as Jack's vision dimmed. And then, with one final, breathless whisper, the darkness swallowed him whole. Jack's mind was unraveling. The oppressive atmosphere of the tent seemed to press down on him with a force that made it hard to breathe, and his vision wavered, blurring at the edges. The figures in the shadows, the grotesque marionettes with hollow eyes and twisted limbs, loomed closer, but it wasn't just their presence that terrified him. It was the way they moved, the way they seemed to feed off his fear, growing more defined and real with each panicked thought. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something far worse, something ancient and foul that clung to his skin and filled his lungs. Jack's heart raced, pounding in his chest as though it were trying to escape his body. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. The tent, the shadows, the whispers, they had become a prison, tightening around him like a noose. And then the visions began. At first, they were subtle, creeping into the edges of his consciousness like dark tendrils. The ground beneath his feet rippled and twisted, and the faces of the shadowy figures warped into grotesque versions of people he once knew. His father's face flickered among them, pale and twisted, his eyes hollow like the rest, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Jack staggered back, bile rising in his throat as he tried to tear his eyes away. But the more he fought, the stronger the visions became. His surroundings shifted, melting into a hellish landscape where the world was nothing but a twisted reflection of his deepest fears. The tent was gone, replaced by the carnival as it once had been, but not the joyful, bustling place he remembered from childhood. Now it was a nightmare, a distorted funhouse where every ride was twisted beyond recognition. The carousel turned slowly, its horses now skeletal, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, warped and sinister, as though it came from somewhere far beyond this world. Jack turned in circles, disoriented, trying to find a way out, but the carnival stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of horrors that threatened to swallow him whole. The whispers returned, louder now, taunting him, promising safety if he would only give in. Jack clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but they slithered into his mind, crawling under his skin like maggots. The fear was all-consuming, threatening to drown him in a sea of terror. And that's when the real temptation set in. The shadows began to twist again, forming shapes out of his worst nightmares. Nightmares he had buried long ago, hoping they would never resurface. He saw himself as a child, standing before his father's grave, his mother weeping beside him. But the grave was wrong. The earth was shifting, moving as though something beneath it was trying to break free. Jack's younger self stood frozen, watching in horror as skeletal hands clawed their way out of the ground, followed by a figure with no face, only darkness where features should have been. The whispers taunted him. "This is what you left behind. This is what you forgot." Suddenly, the figure lunged at Jack, dragging him down into the dirt. His surroundings blurred again, and he was back in the tent, but the fear had not lessened. It had only deepened. The tent's shadows seemed to pulse with life, their black tendrils reaching for him, brushing against his skin like cold fingers. The clown doll, still perched in the toy chest, grinned wider, its cracked porcelain face splitting further as if to mock him. Jack's thoughts spiraled out of control as he realized that the fear itself was becoming something tangible, something he could not escape. The more afraid he became, the more real the horrors around him grew. His mind was betraying him, conjuring terrors that blurred the lines between imagination and reality. The tent rippled with malevolent energy, and the darkness itself seemed to move with a purpose, as if it were alive and watching him. Jack's hands shook as he reached for his phone, desperate to call for help, to do something, anything. But when he looked at the screen, his reflection was not his own. Instead, staring back at him was the face of the clown, its eyes gleaming with malice, its mouth curling into a sadistic grin. The phone slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor, but the vision remained. Everywhere he looked, the clown was there, staring at him from the shadows, lurking just beyond the edge of his sight. It wasn't just in the tent anymore. It was in his mind, and it was feeding off his fear. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The more he let himself be afraid, the stronger the entity became. His fear was a weapon, and it was being used against him. Jack's breathing became ragged as he tried to steady himself, but it was no use. The voices were louder now, shouting, screaming at him to give in. They promised him an end to the terror, an end to the suffering, if only he would surrender to the fear. His vision blurred, the world spinning around him as the ground shifted beneath his feet. He stumbled, his legs giving way as the weight of the fear crushed him. And then, in a moment of clarity, Jack understood the final, cruel temptation. The entity didn't just want him afraid, it wanted him broken. It wanted him to succumb to the fear completely, to let it consume him until there was nothing left. The whispers, the visions, the shadows, they were all tools, designed to push him to the brink of madness. And now, standing at the edge of that abyss, Jack had to make a choice. Would he let the fear win? Would he allow the entity to take him, just as it had taken his father? Or would he fight back, knowing that the only way to escape was to confront the very thing that terrified him most? His chest tightened as the decision weighed on him. The whispers became deafening, and the shadows closed in, pressing against him like a tidal wave of darkness. Jack's body trembled, his mind screaming at him to give in, to let the fear swallow him whole. But in the depths of his terror, a spark of defiance flickered. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that he had faced this before, and survived. The clown's laughter echoed in his ears, mocking, but Jack pushed the fear down, gritting his teeth as he forced himself to stand. The visions twisted and warped around him, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the one thing he still had control over, his own mind. His fear had brought him to this point, but it would not take him further. Not now, not ever. With a final, shuddering breath, Jack stepped forward, plunging into the heart of the darkness, ready to confront whatever lay within. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he plunged deeper into the heart of the darkness, the suffocating shadows closing in around him like a living entity. The air grew colder, so cold it bit at his skin, but the worst of it was the silence. The whispers had stopped. The voices, the taunting, the malicious laughter, all of it had vanished, leaving behind a void so complete it felt as though the world itself had ceased to exist. Jack strained to listen, but all he could hear was the thunderous beat of his own heart, a relentless rhythm that echoed through the oppressive stillness. And then, from the center of the tent, a sound broke through the silence, a low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Jack froze, every muscle in his body tensing. His eyes darted through the darkness, trying to find the source, but the shadows were too thick, too impenetrable. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic scraping, as if long nails were being dragged along the ground. Jack's breath caught in his throat as a shape began to emerge from the gloom, indistinct at first, but slowly taking form. It was the clown, but this time, it was no longer the porcelain doll he had found in the toy chest. It was something much worse. The figure that loomed before him was twisted, grotesque, its body impossibly tall and lanky, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face was a mockery of humanity, a cracked and distorted version of the clown he had once known, but now its eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, and its mouth was stretched into a wide, toothy grin that seemed to split its face in two. The clown's painted smile dripped like wet ink, smearing across its face as it dragged its massive, broken limbs toward him, each step accompanied by the sickening scrape of bone against the floor. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The entity had been waiting for this moment, for him to finally give in and face it. This wasn't just any evil. It was the darkness that had haunted his family for years, a force that had claimed his father, and now it wanted him. The clown was the embodiment of that malevolence, a creature born from the deepest recesses of his fear and the nightmares he had repressed for so long. It had been there all along, lurking in the shadows, feeding on the terror that had plagued him since childhood. The clown's movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Its eyes locked onto Jack's, and in that instant, Jack felt a connection, a horrifying realization that this thing had always been a part of him, a shadow that had clung to his family for generations. The lullaby his mother used to sing, the forgotten memories of his father's disappearance, the whispers that had haunted his childhood, they were all tied to this creature, this entity that had woven itself into the very fabric of his life. And now, it had come to claim him. Jack's chest tightened with fear, but something else stirred deep within him, a spark of defiance, a refusal to let this thing take him the way it had taken his father. He had come too far, fought too hard to succumb to the darkness now. But how could he defeat something that wasn't entirely real, something that fed off his own mind, his own terror? The clown took another step forward, its grin widening as if it could sense his doubt. The tent seemed to shrink around them, the shadows pressing in tighter, suffocating, as the air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. And then Jack saw it. Amidst the swirling darkness, barely visible, was the wooden toy chest. The very same box he had found earlier, its lid still ajar, but now something else lay inside, something glinting faintly in the dim light. Jack's pulse quickened as he recognized it. An old, rusted key, ancient and worn, the same key he had once seen his father use to lock away his nightmares when he was a child. The memory hit him like a lightning bolt, sharp and vivid. His father sitting at the edge of his bed, telling him stories of monsters, and then reassuring him that as long as the key stayed hidden, the monsters could never get out. But now, the key was out, and the monsters were real. Jack knew what he had to do. He lunged for the chest, his fingers wrapping around the cold, metal key. The moment he touched it, a wave of nausea washed over him, as if the very act of holding the key had unlocked something deep within him, something ancient and terrible. The clown let out a guttural growl, its voice a horrific mix of laughter and rage, and for the first time, it moved with speed, lunging toward Jack with unnatural agility, its limbs contorting as it reached out for him. But Jack was faster. His hand shot forward, shoving the key into the lock of the chest with a force that shook the ground beneath him. The chest snapped shut with a deafening bang, and in that instant, the entire tent trembled, the shadows recoiling as if struck by an unseen force. The clown shrieked, a high-pitched wail that pierced Jack's ears, its body convulsing as the darkness around it began to unravel. The tent walls rippled and warped, the air vibrating with a strange, otherworldly energy. The clown stumbled, its once powerful form now faltering, shrinking as the shadows it had commanded began to dissipate. Jack watched breathless as the entity's body contorted, collapsing in on itself, the malevolent light in its eyes flickering and fading. And then, with one final, tortured scream, the clown was gone, swallowed by the darkness that had once served it. The tent around Jack shuddered one last time before collapsing in on itself, the walls crumbling into dust, leaving behind only silence. But as Jack stood there, panting, his heart still racing, he felt no relief. The clown was gone, but the air still felt thick, heavy with a lingering presence. He could feel it. The darkness wasn't truly defeated. It had merely been pushed back, waiting, watching. And Jack knew deep down that it was still connected to him, still tethered to his family. It would return, in time, as it always had. The realization settled over him like a cold, wet shroud. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The darkness that once suffocated the tent had collapsed, but the air around Jack remained thick, with an oppressive, sinister weight. The clown was gone, but something far more ancient and malevolent lingered in the void left behind. Jack stood alone, his heart still hammering in his chest, his mind reeling from what he had just endured. His hand clutched the rusted key, its cold metal biting into his palm as if it held the last remnants of his sanity. He had shut the chest, locked away the evil, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The tent may have crumbled, but the malevolence had not been defeated, only temporarily banished. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble, sending shockwaves of fear rippling through his body. The earth groaned as though something massive and unseen was stirring from its slumber, rising from the depths of the shadows. The air grew colder, the faintest whisper of a voice brushing against Jack's ear, a voice not of the clown, but something far older, darker. It was as though the entity itself, the very source of the evil that haunted the Dark Circus, had awakened. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. The clown had merely been a puppet, a vessel for something far worse that had yet to reveal itself. The ground split open before him with a deafening crack, and from the abyss rose a figure unlike anything Jack had ever seen. It was neither human nor monster, but something caught between worlds, an embodiment of the very darkness that had plagued his family for generations. Its form shifted and flickered like smoke, ever-changing, as though it couldn't fully exist in the physical realm. Its face was a void of swirling shadows, featureless except for two glowing eyes that burned with an intensity that sent a chill down Jack's spine. The creature towered over him, its presence suffocating, its very being pulsing with malice and hatred. The whispers returned, louder now, not just in the air, but in Jack's very mind. They echoed inside his skull, promising him safety, relief, if only he would surrender. His fingers tightened around the key, but his resolve was crumbling under the weight of the fear. The entity's voice cut through the whispers, deep and hollow, a sound that resonated from within the earth itself. "You cannot escape what you are," it hissed, its words slithering into Jack's consciousness. "You are part of this. You always have been." The shadows around the entity writhed and stretched, reaching out toward Jack like tendrils of darkness, brushing against his skin, sending shivers down his spine. The entity's presence was overwhelming, pressing in on him from all sides. It was as though the darkness was alive, sentient, and had been waiting for this moment, for Jack to come to it willingly. His father had once faced this same terror, And now Jack stood in his place, at the mercy of the same ancient force. Jack stumbled backward, his legs shaking as the full weight of the situation crashed over him. The truth, the awful, unrelenting truth, pressed down on him like a vice. This creature wasn't just a random evil. It was tied to him, to his bloodline. His family had been cursed by this darkness long before he was born, and each generation had been forced to confront it. His father, his grandfather, and now him. It was a cycle, an unbroken chain of horror, and the entity had been there all along, pulling the strings. "You can't fight me," the entity growled, its voice like gravel shifting beneath the earth. "I am in your blood. I am in your soul." Jack felt his knees weaken as the weight of the words sunk in. He had locked away the clown, but this was something far more dangerous, far more personal. The shadows swirled around him, pulling at his limbs, his mind. The entity fed on fear, on doubt, and Jack had plenty of both coursing through his veins. His thoughts raced, and panic surged within him. Was this his fate? To fall to the same darkness that had claimed his father? To become part of this cursed legacy? The whispers clawed at his sanity, and for a brief moment, he considered giving in. The temptation was there, gnawing at him. What was the point of fighting when the evil was so deeply intertwined with him? The shadows seemed to sense his weakness, curling tighter around him, feeding off his indecision. But then, through the fog of fear and doubt, a flicker of something else ignited within Jack. A memory, his father's voice, soft and steady, telling him stories of bravery, of fighting back against impossible odds. He remembered the nights his father would sit beside him after nightmares, reassuring him that no matter how dark the night, there was always a way out. Jack clung to that memory like a lifeline, refusing to let it slip away. "No," Jack whispered, his voice trembling but determined. "I won't let you win." The entity snarled, its form shifting violently, the shadows around it thrashing as though enraged by Jack's defiance. It lunged at him, its dark tendrils reaching for his throat. But Jack moved quicker. With a surge of adrenaline, he thrust the key forward, plunging it into the heart of the entity's form. The moment the key made contact, a piercing scream erupted from the creature, loud enough to shake the very foundations of the world around them. The shadows recoiled, pulling back as if burned, and the entity writhed in agony, its form flickering in and out of existence. The key glowed brightly, emitting a light so powerful it cut through the darkness like a blade. Jack pushed harder, forcing the key deeper into the creature's chest, and with each inch, the entity's screams grew louder, more frantic. The darkness that had surrounded Jack for so long began to fracture, splitting apart, breaking under the weight of the light. The tent, the ground, everything around him seemed to shimmer and fade, as though reality itself was being torn apart by the confrontation. The entity's voice, once so powerful and menacing, became a desperate whisper. "You can't stop it," it hissed. "You are me. I am you." But Jack didn't stop. He twisted the key with all the strength he had left, and with a final, ear-splitting scream, the entity's form exploded into a burst of black smoke. The shadows evaporated, sucked into the void from which they had come. Jack collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath as the world around him began to settle. The suffocating darkness that had haunted him for so long was gone, but the air was still heavy with the remnants of what had been. The tent had crumbled into dust, and the world beyond it had returned to its eerie, quiet stillness. Jack looked down at the key in his hand, its glow fading, but the weight of it remained, a reminder of the battle he had just fought and the legacy he had broken. Or had he? He wasn't sure. The entity's words echoed in his mind. "You are me. I am you." Was the darkness truly gone, or had it simply retreated, waiting for another chance to resurface? Jack didn't know. All he knew was that for now, the battle was over, but the war he feared might never end. Jack stood in the empty, crumbling remains of what was once the Dark Circus, his body trembling from exhaustion, his mind reeling from the ordeal. The darkness that had suffocated the air seemed to have dissipated, but an eerie stillness hung in its place. The world around him had returned to a strange kind of normalcy, though it felt fragile, like a thin layer of reality stretched over something much darker lurking beneath. The key in his hand had cooled, its once blinding light now dim, almost dull, as if it had fulfilled its purpose. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that its purpose wasn't truly finished. The silence was deafening. No wind, no distant hum of life beyond the park, only the hollow emptiness left in the wake of the battle. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, and though the clown was gone, though the monstrous entity had been banished, he couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone. Something was still here, watching, waiting. The air still felt thick, as if the shadows themselves were holding their breath, anticipating something Jack couldn't see. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the remnants of the circus, but everything was still, too still. As he took a tentative step forward, the ground beneath him crunched softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. His footsteps felt heavier than they should have, like the earth was reluctant to let him go, as though it clung to him, refusing to release him from this place. Jack's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The tent had collapsed, the evil had been vanquished, hadn't it? But as he moved deeper into the ruins, a gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a fleeting shadow at the corner of his vision. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he turned slowly, half expecting to see the clown's twisted grin staring back at him from the darkness. But there was nothing, just empty space. His pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as the silence pressed in around him. He was being watched, he could feel it, but by what? The darkness had been banished, hadn't it? Or had it merely retreated? Biding its time, Jack's thoughts raced as he replayed the final moments of the battle in his mind. The key had worked. He had plunged it into the heart of the entity, and the darkness had fractured, collapsing in on itself. But as the creature had faded into nothingness, its final words lingered, echoing through Jack's mind like a haunting refrain. "You are me. I am you." He had dismissed it as the last desperate attempt of a defeated entity to cling to power, but now, standing in the eerie silence, he wasn't so sure. The ground beneath his feet shifted slightly, a subtle tremor that sent a wave of unease through him. Jack knelt down, his hand brushing against the dirt, and as his fingers dug into the soil, he felt something cold and metallic. He pulled it free, a small, rusted piece of the key. It had broken when he locked the chest, but this shard felt wrong, like it still pulsed with a faint, unnatural energy. Jack's grip tightened around it as a shiver ran down his spine. The key had closed the chest, but it hadn't sealed the darkness for good. It was still here, in pieces, waiting for the right moment to break free again. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, lengthening unnaturally as the light faded from the sky. Jack's breath hitched as he realized the sun was setting, and with it, the last vestiges of normalcy were disappearing. The circus, the darkness, it thrived in the night. He had come during the day, but now, as twilight crept over the horizon, the air grew thick with anticipation, as though the place itself was awakening from a brief slumber, hungry for more. Jack's skin prickled with fear as the familiar feeling of dread settled in the pit of his stomach. Something moved again, this time more distinct, a shadow slithering across the ground, too fluid to belong to anything natural. Jack's eyes widened, his heart hammering as he watched the shadow stretch, twist, and take shape. It was almost human, almost familiar. It moved like the clown had, slow, deliberate, and impossibly wrong. Jack stepped back, his feet stumbling over broken debris as his pulse raced. The key fragment burned in his hand now, the faint glow returning as if it were reacting to the presence of the darkness that lingered. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. They weren't just in his head anymore. They surrounded him, slipping through the cracks in reality, filling the air with their malicious intent. You didn't stop it. The words were clear now, undeniable, as they circled around him, mocking. It's still here. It will always be here. Jack's chest tightened as the full weight of the truth crashed over him. The clown, the entity, they had been nothing more than manifestations of something much older, much deeper. The evil wasn't gone. It couldn't be defeated. It was bound to this place, and now, to him. Jack took another step back, his mind racing. Was this his fate? To carry this darkness with him forever? A part of it ingrained in his very soul? He remembered the entity's words. You are me. I am you. And a sickening realization dawned on him. The darkness hadn't been destroyed. It had merely transferred to him. It had used the key, the battle, as a distraction, a way to burrow deeper into his mind, into his essence. Jack's hand shook as he looked down at the key fragment, its glow pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, urging him to stay, to give in. The shadows stretched toward him, their tendrils brushing against his skin like icy fingers. Jack's vision blurred as the world around him began to warp, reality twisting into something unfamiliar and hostile. The circus wasn't gone. It had never truly been a place. It was a force, a presence, and it had claimed him as its own. He was part of a cycle now, bound to the darkness in a way he couldn't escape. With a final burst of strength, Jack turned and ran, his legs shaking as he sprinted through the remains of the circus. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each step, but he refused to stop, refused to let the shadows claim him. But even as he fled, he knew the truth. He could never escape. The darkness was inside him now, woven into the very fabric of his being. It would follow him, haunt him, and one day, it would pull him back. As Jack reached the edge of the circus grounds, he dared one final glance over his shoulder. The tent was gone, the ruins fading into the shadows of the encroaching night. But in the distance, just beyond the veil of darkness, he saw it. The faint outline of the clown, standing motionless, watching, waiting. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized the terrible truth. No matter how far he ran, no matter where he went, the darkness would follow. The circus would always be with him. And one day, when the time was right, it would come for him again. The shadows whispered one final promise, their voices carrying on the wind as Jack disappeared into the night. We will return.